Hi everyone. In this video I want to talk a little bit about some adolescent developmental tasks and some phases that we know adolescents go through. So first off, I want to talk about some basic principles of this class, SEDE 7335, Adolescent Literature. Here's some basic information that we know about adolescence and reading. We know that if we want youngsters to continue to read, they have to enjoy what they're reading. And you saw some evidence of that in that Penny Kittle video that we watched in our first course meeting online. When kids don't enjoy what they're reading, they abandon it. We also know that different individuals like different kinds of books. You guys heard this in our discussions about what we all like to read. Nobody likes to have somebody else's taste impressed upon them. And when we are always mandating or dictating what kids read, we are impressing our tastes upon them. We know that kids go through reading phases that remain relatively the same from child to child. Certain children may pass through a phase more quickly than others, but all adolescents pass through the same phases. We also know that these reading phases are probably related to some basic psychological problems or occurrences that the adolescent is facing at different stages in growing up. We know that enthusiasm for reading can be stimulated. A child can be helped but not forced toward reading maturity. And we know that reading material must be available. What the research says is that, yes, the school library is beneficial, but students read more when they have books in close proximity. So you want to make sure that you have books in your own classroom so that they're easily accessible to students. That does not at all negate the need for a school library. We still need a school library. It works in conjunction with the different classroom libraries that teachers maintain. So when we think about developmental tasks, what the research shows is that if books are to have any meaning to the adolescent, they need to be related to his or her personal and social needs. Another way of saying that is that they need to be relevant to the reader. A man named Robert Havighurst described these developmental tasks in his book that was titled Human Development and Education. So let's talk about some of these developmental tasks. The first one is what he talked about as discovering his or her sex role in the culture. When we talk about adolescence, this one becomes particularly sensitive with the onset of puberty. Kids have a lot of different ideas about their sex roles, and tons of different ideas are out there bombarding them through the media, through the internet, social media, all of that. And what we want to make sure of is that kids are exposed to a range of viewpoints. Now, this whole idea of understanding their sex role in the culture has changed as our society has changed. So kids have different ideas about sex roles than we may have had when we were adolescents. So you want to make sure that you always keep that in mind. Another developmental task that Havighurst described is the idea of developing new relationships with people his or her own age. And we're talking specifically here about adolescents. So if we think about elementary level children, younger children, their friendships tend to be based on proximity. So you tend to be friends with the people who live near you because that's who you see all the time. So when I was in elementary school, the kids in my neighborhood who were my friends were the people who lived close by me. So Susan and Amy lived 2 doors down. Kathy Coleman lived about 3 doors down the street that ran perpendicular to mine. I was in school with them, kindergarten through 5th grade. Then when I moved to middle school, and this happens in most feeder patterns, kids go into a middle school from a variety of feeder schools. So you get kids feeding into one middle school from 3 or 4 different elementary schools. So you're not necessarily friends with the people at that point that live close to you. You tend to start being friends with people who share similar interests. So when I went to 6th grade, one of the electives that I signed up for was band. So from that moment until I graduated from high school, many of my friends were other people who were in band with me. So my friend Bobby, she played the flute. She and I didn't know each other in elementary school, but once we got to middle school, we both sat on the first row in band from sixth grade through 12th grade. So we became good friends, and it was based on that mutual interest. So the same thing happens for adolescents. When they hit adolescence, their friendships tend to be based on mutual interest rather than who lives close to them. The next developmental task that Habakhurst described is the idea of achieving an easy relationship with members of the opposite sex. And you guys are all working in schools. You see with kids when this happens. You can tell once they've developed an easy relationship with somebody of the opposite sex. And the easiest way to tell is to go to a school dance. The kids who haven't achieved this developmental task are segregating themselves in the auditorium or in the cafeteria where the dance is being held. Boys on one side of the room, girls on the other. The kids who have achieved this are dancing together in the middle of the room, and you're having to go through as the chaperone and tell them that you need to see a little air between them. Those kids have achieved an easy relationship with the opposite sex. The next developmental task that Habakhurst defined was the idea of the adolescent accepting his or her physical body. And you guys work with adolescents, so you see what a struggle this is for our teens today. It's very difficult for them to deal with, and they have all kinds of outside influences that are giving them different ideas about what is okay in terms of their own physical body. Puberty doesn't make this any easier. The next one that Habakhurst talked about is the idea of having a changing relationship with your parents. So when kids are in elementary school, they tend to be very dependent on their parents, on their family members. And then when they start to move into their teenage years, they're really struggling to kind of shed that dependence and become much more independent. We see a lot of rebellion by the adolescents against the adult world. Um, and it shows up in the way they dress, the way they talk, um, the information that they choose to share, or the information that they choose to keep a secret. Many of you can probably think back to when you were a teen and how your relationship with your parents changed. The next one that he talked about is the whole idea of working for pay. That's part of the independence that kids are seeking. So when you're a young kid, it doesn't occur to you that to be embarrassed about asking your parents for money if you're around friends. But once you become a teenager, you're less inclined to ask your parents in front of your friends. You'd rather have that money in your pocket, ready to spend. You want to be able to make decisions about what kinds of things you want to spend your money on. So that's when kids start to be interested in working for pay. That's when they start to ask about what kind of chores can they do to make some money that they can carry in their own pocket. Because when you're a teenager, it's not really cool for your parents to drop you off at the mall and your friend's sitting there waiting and you say, "Hey mom, can I borrow 20 bucks?" You want to already have it in your wallet, burning a hole. Another developmental task that Habakhurst described is the whole notion of finding a vocation or career education. So back when I was in middle school, which was a long time ago, we actually took a careers course, and we had to take an aptitude test as part of that course. And that aptitude test, the counselors and the careers teacher got the results, and they sat down and conferred with each of us about what kind of jobs did we have an aptitude for? Would possibly be a good match for us? Um, a lot of times in schools today, those careers classes have gone away, and we see instead middle schools and high schools and even elementary schools hosting career days where they bring in all kinds of people from different walks of life to talk to kids about their jobs and what they do on a daily basis. It's even though that we're talking about teens, that's a lot for teens to start thinking about. What do you want to be when you grow up? Some of us haven't even figured out yet what we want to be when we grow up. So if you think about asking an eighth grader or a ninth grader, that's a little bit overwhelming. because you don't really know enough about what you could be. What does happen though with teens as they move from early elementary years on into their adolescence is they start to think more realistically about what they could be when they grow up. So in elementary school, kids want to be superheroes, or they all want to be an NBA star or a rap singer. And as kids start to get a little older, they start to see that not everybody's going to be an NBA star. Not everybody's going to be a prima ballerina, that there are a lot of other jobs out there that they might be better suited for. The next developmental task that Habakhurst outlined is the idea of becoming aware of his or her value patterns. Um, Things like, what do they think about drugs? What do they think about premarital sex, about right, about wrong? Books give kids the opportunity to test out different value patterns. When they're younger, um, they kind of mirror the value patterns that they see around them in their family. They have the value patterns that their parents have. But as you guys all know, you've experienced this yourself and you've seen it with your own students. As they move into those teenage years, they start to push the boundaries and to try on different things. So one day they may be a good little student, a good little Boy Scout or Girl Scout, and the next day they want to be in a gang. So they're trying different things out, putting on different hats, if you will. So part of the reason we talk about this in children's literature and then in this class, adolescent literature, is because we want to make sure that we have books in which characters are working through these tasks. These are the kinds of books that adolescents enjoy. They want to be able to read books where they can see characters who are trying to manipulate and maneuver their way through these tasks. These are what we call adolescent or young adult literature. Why does this have any bearing in young adult literature? Because this is the basic outline for what you're going to read over the course of the semester. When we think about adolescent literature or young adult literature, most of the novels are going to focus on one or two of the tasks that Habakhurst outlined in his research, and that's what kids are interested in. You want to make sure that you have a wide variety of books that deal with these kinds of topics because it's going to help kids figure out how to accomplish these developmental tasks in their own lives.